They built a steel gate and dug a trench to trap me on my own land. But they didn't know I was a military engineer trained to break through any obstacle. Welcome to HOA Tragedies. Before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. You can't use this road ever again. That's what Linda Harrow, president of the Cedar Ridge HOA, screamed at me one humid morning, her heels planted squarely on the gravel like she owned the entire county. Behind her, two board members nodded like bobbleheads, while a construction crew welded a steel gate across the only road to my farm. I stood there, boots caked with mud from fixing my fence, staring at the barricade that now cut me off from my own home. For a second I thought it was a prank, but when Linda flashed that smug grin and handed me a notice demanding I join her HOA or lose all access, the truth hit me. This wasn't a prank. It was extortion dressed up as community standards. What Linda didn't know was that I'd spent years as a military engineer, trained to find a way through walls, over obstacles, and yes, even under them. If she wanted war, she just lit the fuse. My name's Miles Carter. After 2 decades as a military engineer, I walked away from the bureaucracy and battles of that life. What I wanted was simple. Quiet land where the only rules were the ones I set. That's what I thought I'd found in Redstone County. My property deed was ironclad, my boundaries surveyed, my fence lines sharp. I bought 60 acres of open pasture and dense timber with one promise to myself. No one would dictate how I lived again. But I made one miscalculation. The only road to my land passed through Cedar Ridge, a subdivision wrapped in the grip of Linda's HOA. For decades, locals had used that stretch without issue. Farmers, delivery drivers, even the county fire department rolled through without a raised eyebrow. But the moment Linda grabbed the gavel as HOA president, she saw dollar signs. To her, the road wasn't a lifeline, it was leverage. She wasted no time delivering her verdict. If I wanted access to my own home, I'd have to join Cedar Ridge HOA and pay their monthly dues. To anyone else, it might have sounded like a polite request for community contribution. To me, it was extortion with a smile. I reminded her my land had never been part of their subdivision, that my deed was independent. She didn't care. Linda was the kind of person who turned technicalities into weapons. What stung wasn't just her arrogance, but the quiet confidence that I'd fold. She thought I was just another landowner who'd grumble, then sign the papers out of convenience. But I'd built bridges under mortar fire, rerouted convoys through hostile ground, and solved problems with lives hanging in the balance. Compared to that, Linda and her clipboards were a nuisance, yet a nuisance with power in her hands. I could feel the tension mounting as she handed me a notice printed on thick paper, the HOA seal stamped in gold at the top like a royal decree. It demanded compliance within a week. Failure to join, the fine print read, would result in restricted access to Cedar Ridge private roadways. My hands clenched as I scanned the words. Restricted access meant no access. And no access meant being trapped on my own land. That night, I sat on my porch, staring at the gravel road that connected me to the rest of the county. It looked harmless, fragile under the weight of Linda's ambition, but I knew it was about to become a battlefield. A man shouldn't have to fight to drive home. Yet, if that's what it took, I was ready. The next morning, the war officially began. I woke to the grinding sound of machinery. At first, I thought it was a neighbor clearing brush or hauling timber, but the closer I listened, the more metallic and deliberate it sounded. I threw on my boots and walked to the property line, only to be met with a sight that twisted my stomach. Right where Cedar Ridge began, a construction crew was installing a massive steel gate. Posts sunk deep into the earth, beams welded tight, and a motorized arm stretching across the road like the jaws of a trap. Cement trucks idled, their exhaust spilling into the crisp country air. And there she was, Linda, standing at the center of it all like a monarch surveying her domain. She didn't wave, didn't flinch. She only smiled as sparks flew from the welders' torches, sealing my fate one joint at a time. I stormed toward her, demanding an explanation. She answered sweetly, like she was doing me a favor. Since you've chosen not to join the HOA, the board has voted to restrict your use of Cedar Ridge infrastructure. Infrastructure? That was her word for the only road to my land. It wasn't just petty, it was calculated. She wanted me isolated, desperate, cornered. She thought she could choke me into submission, but all she did was light a fuse I had no intention of putting out. That night, as the welders packed up and the new gate stood gleaming under the moonlight, I made myself a promise. Linda Harrow wanted a fight, and she'd get one. She had no idea just how far I was willing to go. By the weekend, the gate was finished. Solid steel, tall enough to stop a tractor, reinforced with concrete footings 3 feet deep. But that wasn't enough for Linda. Monday morning, I stood at the edge of Cedar Ridge's boundary and watched a backhoe carving into the gravel road itself, piling dirt into mounds on either side. They were digging a trench, a crude ditch right before the gate. Even if I cut the lock or forced my way through, I'd be stuck axle-deep in mud and rubble. It wasn't just a blockade anymore. It was sabotage. I confronted the crew, demanding to know under what authority they were tearing up the road. They shrugged, pointing toward Linda. She was perched in a folding chair with a sun hat, sipping iced tea like she was watching a 4th of July parade. When she saw me, she waved her glass in mock salute. "Community improvements," she called out, making sure non-members don't trespass. Trespass. That word hit me harder than the sound of the backhoe. According to her, I wasn't a landowner trying to reach my property. I was an intruder. I called the sheriff's office. When a deputy arrived, an older man with weary eyes, he shook his head at the gate and trench. I showed him my deed, explained the decades of uninterrupted use, begged him to cite them for obstruction. He sighed, scratching the back of his neck. "Technically," he said, "the HOA owns this stretch. It's private property. They can control access." I nearly exploded. "So they can cut me off from my own land?" The deputy hesitated. "It's complicated. You might have a case under easement law in this state. If you can prove long-term open use of a road, or that your land is otherwise landlocked, the courts can recognize a right-of-way. But those cases take time, months, even years. Until then, it's a gray area, a gray area." That was the law's way of telling me I was on my own. I drove home in silence, fury boiling just beneath the surface. For the next few days, I improvised. I borrowed a dirt bike, blazing a trail through the forest that skirted Cedar Ridge entirely. It was rough, roots, rocks, and streams, but it got me out. For supplies, I called in favors. A buddy from my service days flew a small chopper, lowering pallets of feed and fuel directly into my pasture. Linda nearly choked on her lemonade when she saw that bird hovering over her subdivision. She filed complaints about unauthorized aerial disturbances. The sheriff tossed them in the trash, but Linda wasn't done. She doubled down. Soon, I started receiving noise violation notices from the HOA, ridiculous on their face since I wasn't even a member. One accused me of operating industrial machinery at midnight. Another claimed I damaged HOA property by driving near the gate. Pure fiction. Then came a stack of certified letters threatening civil action. Each envelope carried her signature, neat and sharp like a dagger. She wanted to bury me in paper as much as she wanted to bury me behind that gate. One evening, I drove my dirt bike back from town, headlights bouncing across the uneven trail I'd hacked through the woods. As I neared my land, I saw floodlights blazing at the gate. Linda and a small army of HOA loyalists stood there, supervising as the backhoe deepened the trench. They weren't reinforcing it for safety. They were turning it into a moat, a dozen feet across, another 4 deep. I pulled off my helmet, stared at the spectacle, and laughed. It was madness. Linda spotted me. Her smile was poison. "Find another way home, Miles," she shouted. "This road belongs to Cedar Ridge." I didn't answer. I didn't need to, Because at that moment, an idea sparked in my mind, one so bold it made me grin despite the rage. If Linda wanted to dig down, fine, I'd go deeper. Back in my workshop, I unrolled blueprints I hadn't touched since the army. Field sketches of culverts, reinforced tunnels, emergency bypass systems. I knew soil stability, load tolerances, shoring methods. Building a tunnel wasn't just possible. It was my specialty. Still, I wasn't reckless. I dialed 8111, the call before you dig service, to ensure no utilities ran under that road. The map came back clean. Next, I drove stakes into the ground, mapping the slope of the terrain. With some help, I could bore under Cedar Ridge's gate and trench, connecting my side of the property to the county road beyond. It didn't need to be pretty. It just needed to work. I called 2 old service buddies, guys who knew how to handle shovels and power tools as well as rifles. When I explained the situation, they didn't hesitate. "You're telling me some HOA witch is trying to blockade you?" One laughed. "Hell yes, I'm in." Under the cover of darkness, we began pickaxes, drills, and elbow grease. We hauled dirt out by the bucket, laying plywood across the walls, reinforcing with scrap steel. We kept the tunnel just wide enough for a truck, low enough to avoid collapse, and ventilated with a rigged fan system. It was grueling work, but every scoop of soil was a small victory against Linda's tyranny. Meanwhile, she strutted around the gate by day, bragging to her board about how she'd forced me into checkmate. She had no clue I was tunneling under her nose, and with each passing night, that tunnel inched closer to completion. By the end of the second week, my tunnel was nearly functional. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't supposed to be, but it was sturdy. Reinforced beams lined the walls, a gravel bed kept the floor dry, and the airflow system hummed steadily thanks to a salvaged generator. I'd built enough culverts in combat zones to know what would hold and what would collapse. This one was safe, maybe safer than the road above, now little more than a barricade and a moat masquerading as community improvements. But Linda wasn't backing off. Her aggression escalated. She began patrolling the gate like a sentry, clipboard in hand, issuing verbal threats to anyone who slowed near the barricade. Delivery drivers were turned away. Even the county trash truck was denied access one morning, sparking a shouting match between the HOA and a furious sanitation worker. Linda didn't care. Control was her oxygen, and she was addicted to the high. I filed formal complaints with the sheriff's office, citing interference with emergency access. I met with the county fire marshal, who shook his head at the trench. "This isn't just harassment," he said. "If one of your buildings caught fire or you had a medical emergency, no fire engine or ambulance could reach you. That's a violation of safety standards." He mentioned the National Fire Protection Association's guidelines. Clear access roads were non-negotiable in rural areas. The HOA might own the asphalt, but they didn't own common sense. Armed with that statement, I returned to Linda. She was standing at the gate in her usual uniform. Pressed blouse, manicured nails, sunglasses perched like she was surveying a battlefield. I laid the marshal's words down flat. "You're not just cutting me off," I said. "You're endangering everyone. Fire, ambulance, sheriff, none of them can get through this mess." Her smile didn't waver. "That sounds like your problem, not ours." That answer told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't about safety or fairness or bylaws. It was about power. She wanted to prove she could bend me until I broke. But what she didn't know was that I'd been tested by worse. A dictator with a clipboard was nothing compared to real battlefields. Still, the pressure was mounting. Linda began mailing certified letters directly to my house, accusing me of trespass, aerial disturbances from the helicopter drop, even soil destabilization due to my dirt bike tracks. Each letter ended with the same line: "Failure to comply will result in immediate legal action." I knew she was bluffing, at least partly, but the weight of those envelopes piled up like sandbags. trying to crush me under bureaucracy. One night, as I was reinforcing a section of tunnel wall with steel braces, headlights appeared at the edge of my pasture. My dog barked furiously. I grabbed a flashlight and walked out, heart pounding. A pickup truck idled by the fence. Inside were two neighbors, farmers from beyond Cedar Ridge, who'd heard rumors of what Linda was doing. "You really building a tunnel?" one asked, eyes wide. "Sure am," I said. They grinned. "Good. About damn time someone stood up to her." It turned out I wasn't the only one Linda had tried to strong-arm. One neighbor had been fined for leaving hay bales visible from the subdivision road. Another was accused of excessive tractor noise. None of them had agreed to join Cedar Ridge, but Linda had been reaching her claws further every year. My fight wasn't just mine anymore. It was a rallying point. Within days, volunteers started showing up. Retired vets, local handymen, even a high school kid who wanted to practice welding. We worked in shifts, digging and bracing, hauling dirt in barrels we disguised with tarps. Every scoop of soil became another act of defiance. Meanwhile, Linda doubled down. She installed security cameras around the gate, convinced I'd try to ram it with my truck. She hired a private security guard, an overpaid mall cop who spent more time scrolling on his phone than guarding anything. And she held HOA meetings where she spun elaborate tales about me being reckless, dangerous, a security threat to their peaceful neighborhood. But she was losing her grip. Word spread fast in small towns, and soon even some Cedar Ridge residents were whispering that Linda had gone too far. "Blocking a man from his land," one muttered at the grocery store. "That's not HOA business. That's tyranny." I knew I had to document everything. I set up motion-activated cameras along my property line. They captured footage of Linda pacing like a hawk, of the trench deepening, of workers reinforcing the barricade. I archived every certified letter, every fake violation, every absurd threat. If this went to court, and it was heading that way, I wanted a record so airtight no judge could ignore it. Then came the night of the near disaster. A summer storm rolled in, lightning cracking, rain pouring. Around midnight, I saw flashing lights through the trees. An ambulance was parked helplessly at the trench. One of my neighbors, an older man with heart trouble, had collapsed. Paramedics couldn't reach his house because of Linda's blockade. I sprinted through the mud, shouting that I knew a way. We loaded their gear onto my dirt bike trailer and hauled it across my rough trail through the woods. By the time we reached the man, precious minutes had been lost. He survived, but just barely. That incident lit a fire under me like nothing else. It wasn't just about me anymore. Linda's power games had nearly cost a man his life. I called the sheriff the next morning and filed another complaint, attaching the ambulance report. He sounded weary, but admitted, "If this hits court, that trench will look real bad for the HOA." I smiled grimly. Good, because I'm done playing nice. The tunnel was ready. All that remained was the reveal. I rigged cameras to record from multiple angles, ensuring that when I drove through, the footage would capture every ounce of Linda's disbelief. I even set up a motion-activated spotlight aimed directly at her gate. That night, as rain misted over the valley, I tested the tunnel. The walls held, the braces groaned but stayed solid. My truck crawled forward, headlights cutting through the darkness. And then, just like that, I emerged on the far side of Cedar Ridge, past the gate, past the trench, past all of Linda's walls. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. But the real show would come at sunrise. The dawn of the reveal felt like a mission briefing. I'd spent the night rehearsing every step in my head. Start the truck, drive through the tunnel, record Linda's reaction, and broadcast it for the whole county to see. It wasn't just about proving her wrong anymore. It was about exposing her as the petty tyrant she was. As the sun crept up over Redstone County, I positioned my truck at the mouth of the tunnel. My hands gripped the wheel, adrenaline buzzing through me like static. The tunnel loomed in front of me, dark but reinforced. lit faintly by the string of bulbs we'd rigged along the ceiling. For a second, I thought about all the hours of labor, the buckets of soil hauled out, the sweat, the bruises. All of it had led to this moment. I shifted into drive and eased forward. The walls trembled slightly, but the supports held. My headlights carved a path through the narrow space, tires crunching on gravel. I kept my breathing steady, reminding myself I'd built this with precision. 100 feet later, daylight cracked through the other side. I pressed the gas, and suddenly I was rolling out onto the county road, past the trench, past the steel gate, like a ghost phasing through walls. I parked on the shoulder and killed the engine, heart pounding. For the first time in weeks, I was on the outside without going off-road or begging for favors. The sense of victory was electric. But the real payoff came minutes later. Right on cue, Linda arrived at the gate, clipboard in hand, her hair styled as though she were headed for a photo shoot instead of a standoff. She tapped on her phone, likely logging another incident report. Then she froze, her eyes locked on me as I leaned casually against my truck, arms folded, her jaw slackened. She glanced at the gate, then at the trench, then back at me. "How?" she sputtered. I grinned. "Morning, Linda." She spun around, searching for hidden cameras, for tricks, for anything that explained how I'd bypassed her fortress. Then she saw the faint disturbance in the dirt, just yards from the trench, the subtle mound where the tunnel mouth was concealed. Her face drained of color. "No," she whispered, rushing toward it. "No, no, no." The cameras I'd installed captured everything. Her frantic pacing, her kneeling to scrape at the dirt, her realization dawning like a storm cloud. And then came the eruption. She threw her clipboard to the ground, stomped her heels into the gravel, and let out a screech that echoed across the valley. By noon, the footage was online. I uploaded it to every local forum, every neighborhood group, every Facebook page where HOA gossip festered. The video, HOA Karen outsmarted by a tunnel, spread like wildfire. Neighbors messaged me, laughing at her meltdown. Strangers emailed screenshots of her ranting in community chats, demanding the footage be taken down. But once the internet had it, it was permanent. Linda didn't just lose face. She lost her grip on the HOA. Board members questioned her judgment. A treasurer resigned, citing irreconcilable differences. Even her loyalists began distancing themselves, unwilling to be dragged down by her obsession. But Linda wasn't ready to surrender. 2 days later, a sheriff's deputy knocked on my door with a thick envelope. Inside, a lawsuit. The Cedar Ridge HOA, represented by Linda, accused me of destruction of community infrastructure and illegal tunneling beneath private property. I laughed when I read it. Illegal tunneling? She made it sound like I'd built a subway system. But I knew better than to underestimate paperwork. A lawsuit meant time, money, and court dates. Linda was trying to drain me by dragging me into legal quicksand. Fortunately, I wasn't alone. The video had earned me more than laughs. It earned me allies. People who'd suffered under HOA tyranny reached out. One couple had been fined $200 for leaving Christmas lights up until January 2nd. Another man faced foreclosure threats over unapproved garden gnomes. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns. And when they saw someone push back, they wanted in. Donations poured into a legal defense fund. Local lawyers volunteered hours. Even a retired judge sent a letter of encouragement, reminding me that easement law existed for a reason. If your property is landlocked, the law recognizes your right of ingress and egress. No HOA can erase that. Armed with this, I prepared for battle. My attorney, Rebecca Sloan, filed a countersuit accusing the HOA of harassment, obstruction of property access, and reckless endangerment for blocking emergency services. We submitted the ambulance incident report as Exhibit A, Linda's letters as Exhibit B, the footage of her trench as Exhibit C. By the time the stack was complete, our case was heavier than the trench dirt itself. The court date was set for early fall. Until then, the tension simmered. I kept using the tunnel daily, waving at Linda whenever she stood near the gate. Sometimes I honked, just to watch her flinch. Each time I passed, she turned redder, like a kettle about to whistle. One evening, I drove through while blasting Johnny Cash's "I Walk the Line." Linda shouted something I couldn't hear over the music, but her fist shook in the air like a cartoon villain. My neighbors applauded as I emerged, treating it like a parade. Children clapped, and one kid held up a sign he'd made with marker. "Go Miles! Beat the HOA!" It wasn't just my fight anymore. It had become a spectacle, a lesson, and a warning. The more Linda pushed, the more the community pulled away from her. And though I knew the courtroom showdown would be the true test, I could sense the tide turning. She wanted to isolate me. Instead, she isolated herself. By late summer, Cedar Ridge wasn't just a subdivision. It was a circus. My video had spread beyond Redstone County. People in neighboring towns, even counties away, knew about the HOA Karen beaten by a tunnel. I couldn't go into the feed store or diner without someone slapping me on the back, grinning, "You're the tunnel guy, ain't you?" But with all the laughter came serious stakes. Linda had moved the battle into the legal arena, where she believed her connections and endless appetite for paperwork would crush me. The HOA's lawsuit read like a laundry list of imagined sins: destruction of infrastructure, unauthorized excavation, safety hazards to residents. In her fantasy, I was a mad miner undermining civilization itself. What Linda didn't count on was that I'd been preparing. Every fake violation, every video of the trench, every letter she signed, I'd archived them meticulously. Rebecca organized the evidence into binders thicker than cinder blocks. And then came the bombshell. One of Linda's board members, tired of her tyranny, sent me copies of internal emails. In them, Linda bragged about cutting me off until I joined the HOA, calling it leveraging access as a tool of compliance. In plain English, extortion. Rebecca smiled when she read them. "She just handed us your Exhibit D," she said. "This isn't a defense anymore. It's an offensive." Meanwhile, Linda's antics at the gate grew unhinged. She installed motion sensors, floodlights, and another so-called security guard, a community college student with a badge he bought online. The day he tried to wave down a county deputy, demanding ID, was the day I knew Linda had lost touch with reality. The turning point came on a stormy Thursday. My cameras caught Linda with a bullhorn, shouting at delivery drivers who dared idle near the trench. "Trespassers will be prosecuted," she shrieked. Most drivers turned around, but one UPS guy, with no patience for HOA drama, ignored her, parked, and hauled packages on foot across the mud. Linda went ballistic, screaming she'd call federal authorities. The driver snapped back, "Lady, I am federal." The clip went viral overnight. Thousands watching as Linda sputtered helplessly, her voice drowned out by the sound of tape ripping across cardboard boxes. That clip became Exhibit E in our arsenal, showing how unreasonably she treated anyone who defied her. But Linda wasn't just embarrassing herself. She was putting lives in danger. Another neighbor called me one evening, panicked. His wife had gone into labor unexpectedly, and the ambulance had been delayed at the trench. He begged for help. Without hesitation, I guided the EMTs through my tunnel to his property. The baby girl was born in a hospital an hour later, safe. Her parents sent me a thank you card with one sentence: "You saved her first breath." That card became Exhibit F. Nothing swayed a judge like evidence that someone's obsession endangered lives. By then, even Cedar Ridge residents were rebelling. Fewer people showed up to Linda's community safety patrols. An elderly couple approached me at the hardware store. "We're sorry," the wife said, glancing around nervously. "We voted for her once. We didn't know she'd turn like this." Linda, of course, refused to admit she was losing ground. At the next HOA meeting, held in their polished clubhouse, she ranted about outsiders infiltrating Cedar Ridge. A neighbor snuck me footage, capturing the blank stares of residents as she claimed I was building a militia underground. One man raised his hand and asked, "Or maybe it's just a tunnel." The laughter that followed nearly drowned her out. By late summer, the courtroom showdown loomed. Rebecca drilled me on testimony, ensuring I stayed calm and factual. "Let her lose control," she advised. "Judges don't like theatrics, and Linda can't help herself." She was right. Our mountain of evidence wasn't just heavy, it was damning. On the morning of the hearing, I walked past reporters on the courthouse steps. Their cameras clicked, microphones shoved in my face. "Mr. Carter, how did you dig the tunnel?" one asked. I smiled carefully. Another shouted, "Do you regret defying the HOA?" I shook my head. Not for a second. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with tension. Linda sat at the plaintiff's table, lips pursed so tightly they were nearly invisible. Her lawyer whispered frantically, but she kept glancing at me like she could burn me alive with her glare. I didn't flinch. I sat there, hands folded, as Rebecca stacked our exhibits in neat order. As the judge entered, silence fell. He reviewed the docket, adjusted his glasses, and said in a measured tone, "Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association versus Miles Carter. Let's proceed." This was it. The moment the war of gates, trenches, and tunnels would be weighed, not in gravel or steel, but in law. And deep down, I knew Linda was about to face something she could never control: the truth. The courtroom smelled faintly of varnished wood and old paper, the kind of place where lives were reshaped, not with fists or bulldozers, but with words. I sat stiff in my chair, shoulders squared, projecting the calm I'd worn through firefights overseas. Across the aisle, Linda Harrow perched like a vulture at the plaintiff's table, her pearl necklace gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She didn't look like someone fighting for justice. She looked like someone clinging to a throne. The judge began with opening statements. Linda's lawyer, a slick man in an ill-fitting suit, launched into a speech about community integrity and protecting residents from dangerous, unauthorized activity. He painted me as a rogue, tunneling under private property without permission, endangering the structural stability of their precious road. At one point, he muttered eco-terrorist, which made the gallery murmur with barely contained laughter. Then it was Rebecca's turn. Calm, precise, and deadly, she laid out the facts. My property was landlocked. The road through Cedar Ridge had been openly used for decades, and the HOA's actions weren't just petty, they were unlawful. She explained easement law in plain English for the judge. If a property has no other access, the owner has a legal right of ingress and egress, regardless of who technically owns the road. She pointed out that the trench and gate weren't improvements, but deliberate obstructions designed to harass me. Then she dropped the first bomb. Linda's internal emails, projected on a screen, bragging about cutting me off until I learned to comply. The courtroom gasped. Linda squirmed, whispering frantically to her lawyer. The judge frowned, already unimpressed. Testimony began. I was called first. Rebecca walked me through my background, my years as a military engineer, my purchase of the land, my reliance on the Cedar Ridge Road. I explained how Linda confronted me, gave me ultimatums, how the gate and trench trapped not just me but endangered others. I told the story of the ambulance delayed by her blockade. As I described hauling paramedics through the woods, I saw the judge's pen pause mid-note. That detail landed hard. Then it was Linda's turn. She strutted to the stand with confidence, but the cracks showed quickly. When Rebecca asked if she'd approved the trench, Linda said yes. When asked if she'd considered the impact on emergency vehicles, she claimed it was irrelevant. When confronted with her emails, she stammered, insisting they were taken out of context. By the third contradiction, the judge's patience was thinning. The highlight came when Rebecca asked, "Miss Harrow, are you aware of the National Fire Protection Association standards requiring unobstructed access for emergency vehicles? Linda smirked. Those don't apply to us. We're a private community. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge's gavel banged for order, but the damage was done. She'd admitted her HOA believed it was above safety law. Over the next 2 days, witnesses testified. The UPS driver with the viral clip took the stand, grinning as he recounted Linda screaming at him for doing his job. The neighbor whose wife gave birth after the tunnel saved the day testified, holding up a photo of his newborn daughter. "If not for that tunnel," he said, "my girl might not be here." The gallery grew quiet, the weight of his words hanging heavy. Linda's lawyer tried to counter by suggesting the tunnel was unsafe, but Rebecca produced blueprints, soil analysis, and photographs of the reinforced structure. "Built to higher standards than most county culverts," she said flatly. The judge nodded in approval. By the time closing arguments arrived, the outcome felt inevitable. Linda's lawyer rambled about community rights and precedent. Rebecca stood, crisp and deliberate. "This case isn't about bylaws, it's about abuse of power. The HOA took a legal easement and turned it into a weapon. They endangered lives, fabricated violations, and sought to extort a landowner. The law doesn't support tyranny, Your Honor. It never has, and it never will." Silence followed. The judge leaned back, hands steepled, eyes lingering on Linda, then on me. Finally, he spoke. "I've heard enough. The actions of the Cedar Ridge HOA were reckless, malicious, and in direct violation of Mr. Carter's rights. This court recognizes his easement and grants permanent unrestricted access to his property via the Cedar Ridge Road. The gate and trench are to be removed immediately at the HOA's expense." Gasps filled the room. The judge wasn't finished. "Furthermore, due to evidence of harassment and endangerment, the Cedar Ridge HOA is ordered to pay damages in the amount of $250,000, including attorney's fees. And Miss Harrow," he turned his gaze directly at her, "you are personally fined $25,000 for abuse of authority and will be removed as HOA president." Effective immediately. Linda's face collapsed, the color draining as if someone had pulled the plug on her. Her lawyer slumped, defeated. Meanwhile, the gallery, neighbors, farmers, strangers who'd followed the saga, burst into hushed cheers. I exhaled for the first time in months. As I left the courtroom, reporters crowded around. "How does it feel to win?" one asked. I paused, glanced back at the doors where Linda still sat, frozen, and said simply, "It feels like justice." But I knew this wasn't the end. Court orders could tear down gates, fines could empty bank accounts, but reputations lived on. And Linda Harrow's was about to crumble faster than her trench. Walking out of that courthouse was like stepping into a different world. For weeks, my life had been narrowed to tunnels, paperwork, and Linda's antics. Now, with the ruling in my hand, I felt a weight lift off my chest I hadn't known since my first day of retirement. The cameras flashed, microphones shoved toward my face. I kept my answers short. Yes, I'm satisfied with the verdict. Yes, the road will reopen. But inside, the satisfaction ran deeper. I hadn't just won for myself. I'd won for every landowner bullied by an HOA drunk on power. The real spectacle came days later, when the county crew rolled in to dismantle Linda's fortress. Trucks rumbled down Cedar Ridge Road. Sparks flew as welders cut apart the steel gate she'd paraded like a crown jewel. A bulldozer filled the trench, packing the dirt flat until the road looked as it always had. A simple gravel lane leading to people's homes. I stood with my neighbors, arms crossed, watching the destruction of her empire. One farmer chuckled, "Funny how quick a queen loses her castle." Linda didn't show up that day. Rumor had it she was holed up in her house, blinds drawn, avoiding the laughter outside. By then, even her allies on the board had turned. With the judge's order removing her as president, Cedar Ridge held an emergency election. For the first time in years, people showed up eager to vote, determined not to repeat their mistake. They chose a soft-spoken schoolteacher named Ellen Drake, someone with no taste for drama. Ellen's first act: announce a policy of transparency and issue a formal apology to the community for Linda's misuse of authority. But the humiliation didn't stop at politics. Local papers ran headlines like HOA President Fined, Ousted After Tunnel Showdown. The viral video of her meltdown at the gate resurfaced, memes spreading online, Linda photoshopped as a medieval guard screaming at villagers, or standing on a moat shouting, "No entry." Even spotted a t-shirt at the feed store with a cartoon tunnel, and the words, "Miles ahead of the HOA." Everywhere Linda went, whispers followed. At the grocery store, a clerk snickered as she fumbled with her wallet. At the post office, someone muttered, "That's the tunnel lady." Once, outside the bank, I saw her slam her car door and burst into tears after a passerby called, "Hey, Karen, dug any ditches lately?" Meanwhile, life for the rest of us began to bloom. Without the constant shadow of HOA threats, people relaxed. Lawns grew naturally instead of being shaved to military precision. Kids left bikes in driveways without fines. Porch lights flickered late into the night with laughter instead of fear. Ellen encouraged neighbors to share their stories, and what poured out was shocking. Fines for hanging laundry, threats over paint colors, accusations about pets barking. Linda had turned a neighborhood into a gulag. Now it was free. I knew I had to mark the victory properly. So I planned what I jokingly called the Liberation Cookout. Flyers went up across town. The invitation, blunt: celebrating freedom from HOA tyranny. All welcome except Linda. That line set the county buzzing. On the day of the party, my pasture transformed. Grills smoked with barbecue, kids raced four-wheelers, a band played country tunes from a flatbed. Neighbors brought pies, veterans showed up with flags, even the sheriff dropped by to shake my hand. At the entrance to the old tunnel, I unveiled a new sign I'd commissioned from a local welder. The Harrow Passage, in memory of petty tyrants everywhere. The crowd roared with laughter, snapping photos. One teenager filmed himself walking through the tunnel, narrating, "This is where Karen lost the war." It went viral within hours. Linda heard about it. She drove past slowly, her car crawling along the road she'd once tried to own. She saw the banners strung high. No more gates, no more queens. She saw the people who'd sat silent at her meetings now cheering around my bonfire. And most of all, she saw me at the tunnel entrance, holding a beer, raising it in mock salute as her car sped away. The humiliation was total. Within a month, her house went up for sale. By the time the for sale sign appeared, it was clear she couldn't stand living where her reign had turned to ridicule. Rumor had it, she left town entirely, moving to a distant suburb where no one knew her name or her tunnel. For me, life settled back into what I'd always wanted. Trucks rumbled down the restored road without incident. The UPS driver honked each time he passed, giving me a thumbs up. The neighbor's baby girl toddled across my porch one afternoon, her mother thanking me again. The fire marshal sent a note. "Glad to see sanity restored. Roads are for safety, not power games." But the tunnel remained. Not because I needed it anymore, the road was open again, but as a symbol. People came to see it, snapping photos, treating it like a landmark. I started jokingly charging $5 for tunnel tours, the money going to a community fund for local farmers. To my surprise, people lined up. The battle had scarred me, yes, but it had also bonded a community, reminded everyone how fragile freedom can be under the weight of petty authority. And it cemented one truth: when someone tries to wall you in, sometimes the best answer is to dig your own way out. As the sun set on the cookout, the band played their last song. I looked across the field at neighbors laughing, kids chasing fireflies, smoke curling from the grills. My tunnel's entrance glowed under the spotlight, the sign reading Harrow Passage, shining like a beacon. Linda had wanted obedience. Instead, she'd forged unity. And standing there, beer in hand, I realized this wasn't just my victory. It belonged to everyone who'd ever stood up to a bully and said, "Not today." The weeks after Linda's departure felt like a new season in Redstone County. The summer heat softened into autumn, and for the first time since I'd moved onto my land, I could drive home without a knot in my stomach. No gates, no trench, no glare from behind sunglasses, just the steady crunch of gravel under my tires and the sight of my farmhouse waiting at the end of the road. But the story didn't end quietly. The court's judgment had left a crater in Cedar Ridge's finances. The $250,000 in damages, plus attorney fees, forced the HOA board to raise questions about where they'd gone wrong. The new president, Ellen Drake, invited me to a community meeting. She stood at the podium, voice steady, and admitted, "We lost sight of what a community is supposed to be." That humility mattered. Neighbors I'd never spoken to shook my hand. Some apologized for not standing up sooner. Others shared stories about Linda's private threats. Fines for Christmas wreaths left up too long. Kids scolded for sidewalk chalk. "We were all scared of her," one woman confessed. "But you reminded us fear only grows when no one resists it." The tunnel itself became a local landmark. Word spread beyond the county, and cars with out-of-state plates parked by my fence. Folks wandering over to see the passage that beat the HOA. I didn't charge them anymore. I just laughed and told the story, sometimes with a bit more exaggeration than the truth. "Yep, right under their noses," I'd say, tapping the steel brace. Built it with my own 2 hands and a few stubborn friends. But deeper than the humor was something lasting. Trust. My neighbors started treating each other differently. Without the constant shadow of petty enforcement, people helped one another instead of tattling. A farmer left spare hay bales by the roadside with a sign, "Take what you need." Kids biked freely again. Even Cedar Ridge's lawns, once mowed to HOA-approved perfection, grew a little wild, and no one cared. It felt like freedom had seeped into the soil itself. As for Linda, her name lived on as a punchline. The Harrow Passage sign stood tall, welded strong. Folks spray-painted funny additions. Karen Crossing, Dictator Detour, even the Gate to Nowhere. I left most of them up. Every laugh was another nail in the coffin of her old empire. And yet, beneath the celebration, I thought often about the lessons buried under the dirt I'd hauled out. It wasn't just about being clever with blueprints or stubborn enough to resist. It was about the danger of letting small tyrannies grow unchecked. An HOA president with a clipboard might not look like a threat, but give her power, silence her critics, and suddenly she's building trenches that block ambulances. That was the real story. How quickly rules become weapons in the wrong hands, and how essential it is for ordinary people to stand up before those weapons get sharp. One crisp October evening, I sat on my porch with a cold beer, watching the last glow of sunset bleed across the horizon. A UPS truck rumbled down the road. No interruptions, no detours. The driver waved, grinning, and called, "Still love that tunnel, Miles." I tipped my beer in salute. The sound of gravel under his tires was sweeter than any victory speech. Life had come full circle. I'd bought this land to find peace, and in fighting for it, I'd found something bigger. A community that finally understood what peace meant. Not rules written in bylaws, but the freedom to live without fear of petty power. If Linda ever watched from afar, I hope she realized it too. No gate, no trench, no clipboard could hold back the simple truth. People will always find a way forward, even if they have to dig a tunnel to do it. What I took from this fight wasn't just satisfaction. It was a reminder that power only lasts as long as people allow it. When one voice stands up, calm, stubborn, and willing to act, it can ripple outward and change everything. My tunnel wasn't just steel and soil. It was defiance carved into the ground. Proof that there's always another way. In life, we all face our own gates and trenches, sometimes built by bosses, neighbors, or even family members who try to control us. The lesson is clear. Don't let anyone wall you in. Know your rights. Stand your ground. And when someone says you can't, show them you can. If this story resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from, and share your own battles with unfair rules or power-hungry people. And if you haven't already, subscribe, because more stories are coming, and you won't want to miss the next twist. Another day, another epic takedown. HOA Tragedies brings you the battles and the breakthroughs. Don't forget to like and follow for more stories of standing up to the clipboard tyrants.